I don't know how many of you watch, but the price of oil has really collapsed in the last few days. It's very important that you understand it's a basic commodity in the world. Why is that happening? That's the important thing. It's happening for two reasons. And we like this in economics because it's nice and neat. It's because of the supply and it's because of the demand. First, the supply. The biggest addition to supply is the United States. Fracking produces a quantity of oil and gas that is huge and is just being pushed into the world market and is more than enough then to drown out whatever cutbacks in producing oil might happen in the Middle East or Africa or Venezuela because of the problems those countries have. And the end result is there's too much oil being attempted to be sold. By itself, that probably wouldn't have made a big difference. Some. But it's happening together with, and this is the important thing, a decrease in demand. Why? Because the global economic system is slowing down. We are headed into a time of major economic decline and trouble. Some of you have asked me in previous months to give more advice that'll help you decide what stocks to buy or not to buy. There are laws that prevent me, by the way, from doing that, and they're good laws in the sense that without knowing your circumstances, anybody gives you advice, you just stop talking to that person because everybody's situation is unique and the advice you get should be based on a real knowledge of your situation, what you want, what you have, and so on.
The law only stops you if you collect money for doing it. You can feel free to tell us whatever you want as long as you don't make us pay for it.
Well, that's not what BAI tells me. I've been told not to ever do that. Anyway, it's another conversation. Okay, so the demand. The slowdown in the economy is for three basic reasons. But actually, before I tell you what the reasons are, let me tell you, make sure you understand. That's not me that's saying the economy is going to slow down. You live in a society that has a serious set of psychological problems. You already know that. I am now going to tell you about some others you might not have known about. Right? We live in an economy in which a dominant position in the media is held by the political leadership, as you can see, even Mr. Trump. It's in the interest of whoever is running the company to say that the economy is either doing wonderfully or about to doing wonderfully or recovering so that it will do wonderfully shortly. That wonderfully is the key word. Therefore, if it is in fact doing badly, they're going to tell you with more intensity how wonderful it is. Or, to use another more technical term, there's going to be a lot of denial going on, which is understandable because who wants to say or face the fact that economic circumstances are deteriorating? You already have enough financial problems. You don't want to hear that more are coming. Unfortunately, I have to tell you, more are coming. But it's not just me. I'm going to just give you three of many sources. Because the disconnect these last few months, between the financial press, which I read as a part of my job, and the public media press that you all get, the gap between them is, I've never seen it like this. So over the last 2 months, just to pick three, UBS used to be the Union Bank of Switzerland, one of the great banks in the world. They've just announced that one of their leading funds, they take money from rich people, basically, and they create funds which they then invest for those rich people to become richer still, which seems to be an important desire on the part of those kinds of people. I don't see anyone nodding, so I guess there's none of them here. The UBS just announced yesterday that in its major fund, it is reducing, I'll use their language, reducing the exposure to equities. That means the proportion of their fund invested in stocks from 50% to 20%. Now, you only do that if you think that the excrement is about to fly into the cooling equipment, right? That's what you, yeah, that's good. I didn't expect it. That's like Trump when he was lecturing to the UN. He didn't expect them to be laughing at him. I hope you're laughing with me. Another example. J.P. Morgan Chase, Jamie Dimon, that's the largest bank in the United States now, J.P. Morgan Chase. They've predicted, which is really nutty to do, but gives you an idea, that we will have a downturn by early 2020. That's less than 18 months from now. Okay? And Goldman Sachs is already advising its clients to move from equities to fixed income, and only the most secure, cautious kinds of fixed income, and to hold an increasing amount of cash. You know, cash doesn't pay interest, and cash doesn't get you dividends. What cash gets you is safety. And they're worried. They don't want you even to buy treasury securities because they expect those to go down, and fairly sharply too. So if UBS and Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan Chase think the economy's turning down, then it's not me saying it. It's a consensus of the people whose job it is to invest money for rich people based on what they think is going to happen in the economy. And they think the stock market is going down because the underlying economy is in deep trouble. Being made worse by the inability of the United States to face anything. Imagining that if you put tariffs against the Chinese and others, it will kind of not matter. Well, it does matter. The Chinese are kicking back. The Chinese are taking all kinds of steps to escape this. And they're doing a pretty good job of it, too. The New York Times cheers the Chinese are really suffering. By the way, they are suffering. But they're doing their share of pushing that suffering back on the United States. That, too, hurt Mr. Trump in the elections. This is a society not facing its problems, denying that it has these problems. The worst thing you could do in this situation is to raise interest rates. Why? Because it makes it more expensive to buy a car, so people will do less of it. It makes it more expensive to buy a home, so people will do less of it. It makes it more expensive to use your credit card, so people will do less of it. It makes it more expensive to borrow to go to college, so people will do less of it. That's not good for the economy. None of that is. Yet they're going to do it. The next interest rate increase is scheduled for December. The Federal Reserve has said it will do that December. That's not very far away, folks. Why would a country have to do that? Because it's got so many problems it has to deal with that way that it can't afford not to do it, even though not doing it is kind of what you ought to do. That's when a society is in real trouble, when it has major economic problems and it can't find a way out. It starts to then behave in desperate ways. Let me give you an example of one of the most desperate. We've just had 30 years in which the gap between rich and poor has gotten much sharper in the United States, in which the top 10% have basically taken all of the productivity gains, all of the increase in output into their own hands, with everybody else kind of treading water. So you come to December 2017 and you have the rich have gotten much, much richer and everybody else is kind of squeezed. What any half-witted person would understand, this is not the time that you give a mammoth tax cut to the rich. They don't need it. And there's 10,000 other things more urgent in this society than to do that. But they did that. And they didn't just do it because Trump believes in it or because the Republicans controlled the Congress. That certainly helped, made it possible to do it quickly. But they did it because they have a basic problem. They don't want an economic downturn, and they are desperate. We barely got out of the last one. How are you going to rationalize to the American people that we just had a crash in 28, then we had 10 years of austerity and difficulty, and at the end of that, we're going to give you another shot, another downturn. I mean, you're starting to stretch the credulity, stretch the toleration of an economic system that works like this. So they can't do that. They need to give this economy another boost. So they did. They cut taxes for corporations, you all remember, from 35% to 21%. They cut taxes for rich people, and they even cut taxes for the average person. And to really boost the economy, they increased government spending on a whole bunch of social programs at the same time. Well, you all know, or you should, that if the government takes in much less money, that's what a tax cut is, while it spends more, it's got to get that money that it's spending more somewhere, and it's not getting it from its revenue. So what the government did is borrow. So the deficit went up crazy. The deficit went up staggeringly, and it was done by the Republicans, who for the last 20 years have been the big fighters against deficits. Suddenly all of that disappeared. Now, this is not about they're not telling the truth, or they don't. Of course they don't. They're politicians in America. What do you expect? But that doesn't answer the question, why did they do that? Well, they did it because they got to keep this crazy system going, and it's not easy to do. You got to give it an enormous boost. And UBS, Goldman, and JP Morgan Chase, that's their argument. We're going to go down in 2019 and 2020 because we're going to run out of the little juice we got from the December 2017 tax. And the underlying reality is terrible. And once that juice up passes, once it's spent, we're back to where we were, only even harder because we have an enormous deficit, which we're afraid could come and haunt us, which is why the interest rates are going up, to make the cost of that deficit more expensive, right? If we owe, the United States owes $20 trillion roughly in its debt, if the interest rates go up, then the government has to generate more money each year to pay interest on that debt. Where's that money going to come from?
From the people we didn't tax.
That's right. They're going to tax you. Or they're going to cut the public services to free up the money to use now to pay to whoever owns the federal debt, which is mostly wealthy people. Whoa. Whoa. These are dead-end choices. Each one is worse than the next one. This is an economy in terrible, difficult circumstances. I think I've told you the story in the past, but I'll tell it again. Because I went to the fancy universities here in the United States, all the right ones. I did. Because of that, I know all these people. It's a small circle. Sitting next to me in my PhD classes at Yale, where I got my PhD, one of my classmates there was a woman named Janet Yellen. Okay? One of my teachers was, well, anyway, it's not important. I know all those people, and they know me, and occasionally we get together for a drink or have dinner. And we have, in the last few months, had a remarkable time. We don't agree on how the country got into this situation. We never did agree. And we don't agree how to get out of it. And we never did. But we sit there and we look at each other and we are astonished, each of us in turn, by the fact that there is something we agree on. And here's what it is. That the United States has not been in this bad an economic situation ever before in our lifetimes. That we agree on. And then we resume disagreeing on why it's like that and what to do about it. But I think it's remarkable that we agree on that, and I think it's a sign that there's a lot more that you ought to be worried about here than perhaps has affected you. Okay, let's turn then to the topics on the agenda. I've answered the question, is another crash coming? No one knows in advance exactly when it comes. If you encounter someone who tells you it's going to happen in November of 2019, talk to somebody else. That's silly. To think you can predict that is childish. Nobody can do that, number one. Number two, capitalism, wherever it has settled for 300, 400 years, has always been an unstable system. It has always had what some people call crises, other people call business cycles, other people call downturns, or lots of words, because it's always there. And on average, it's every 4 to 7 years. That's the average range between downturns. So the last major downturn was 2008, 2009. So you add, this is the kind of math economists are good at. You add 4 to 7 to 2009, and you can kind of get the idea we're overdue. That doesn't mean it's an average, so it doesn't have to be each time that way, but we're overdue. If you add to we're overdue a number of other factors that are crowding in on us, like major conflict with the second most important economy in the world, that's a big one. Conflict with our erstwhile allies because we don't agree on how to deal with China or Iran or any of the other cases where there's real fights. If I had time, I would stop and talk to you about the Iran story because it's extremely important. Not so much about Iran as it is about the conflict between the United States and Europe. The United States is putting sanctions back on Iran. But the sanctions include punishing any company that does business with Iran. That means a French company, for example, the company Total, it's a big oil company in France. The company Total has a big contract of oil dealings with Iran, has had it for years. They just canceled it. They're afraid of what the United States will do to harm them if they continue to trade with Iran. At that point, the French economics minister, Bruno Le Maire, went crazy because it's the end of French sovereignty. A French company based in France is now making decisions on whether or not it trades with Iran, a major partner for it, not based on the French government or the French society or the French elections, but on Mr. Trump, which means they're not sovereign anymore. Mr. Trump is making policy for the... They're crazy about that. They're very angry, very upset. What you saw, that little theater between Trump and Macron around the World War I exhibit the other day, that's really more about the Iran and those other issues than it is about insulting one another, however pleasurable that is, around the World War I memorial. These tensions are very serious. If you know something about European history and Western history, these are the kinds of troubles that ended up in World Wars I and II. And we can dismiss them and so we comfort ourselves that it won't get that far this time, and it may not. But it may. And these are extraordinary issues. The French public, the German public, they really do hate Mr. Trump. One of the reasons he can't go on a lot of places and visits is because he can't go. Because they're going to say things and do things and throw things, and it's not so good. And that has consequences. Okay, let's turn to the elections. One of the interesting things about the elections was the continuing growth of a socialist presence in the United States. I'm going to talk about things about the elections that you haven't read in the major newspapers. Otherwise, why do you come here? You don't need me to repeat.
You're Wednesday, John Oliver.
What?
You're Wednesday, John
No,
Oliver.
that's true too. That's true too. Occupy, Black Lives Matter, Bernie, they've all helped to make it possible. And I think, I speak only for myself, but I hope many of you agree, that we all owe them an enormous debt. Whatever our agreement or disagreement with this and that about what they do, they are opening the space politically in this country after half a century of taboo. It's like a country coming out of hibernation, like we're all bears coming out of the caves where it was impossible to talk about these things without having people look at you as if you either were crazy or an agent of Moscow or something else like that. Nowadays, it's suddenly okay. It's okay to talk about it. I do an awful lot of interviews now on radio and television, and the people there ask me all about socialism as if it were another topic. It's really like another world. 5 years ago, that would never have happened. Now it's okay. It's okay. Ocasio-Cortez here in the Queens, she's like an icon. She's everywhere, and she has a lovely smile, and she makes socialism downright attractive, you know. And Bernie, in his way, also does that sort of thing. And there were several others that were elected this last round. So it's growing. It's systematically growing. And I hope later to give you the details once they're worked out. I got invited to do a debate in Soho here with an editor of Barron's magazine around the proposition socialism is the only humane arrangement for societies to live in. I am going to be in favor, this comes as a shock, and this fellow who's the editor at Barron's is going to be opposed. But this is all their initiative. I didn't have anything, they just invited me, but that's what they want. They want to talk.
He did that same debate last month with the editor of Jacobin, socialism versus capitalism, the editor of Barron's and the...
He's a past editor, he's not the editor now. Epstein is his name.
Yeah.
Gene Epstein. Anyway, I will announce that once we have the details worked out. Anyway, this emergence of socialism means we have to talk a few minutes, you and me, about what the word means, because that's murky. Now, mostly, as best I can tell, I hope I'm not being unfair, but I'm connected in ways with Bernie's campaign and so forth. I know those people and they know me and all that. In the words of most of them, in the minds of most of them, and in what they say, socialism is, by and large, having the government do a lot of good things for the average person. In Bernie's case, he literally speaks of Franklin Delano Roosevelt as the kind of model, as the kind of leadership he would like to replicate, more or less. Now, you remember, Franklin Delano Roosevelt did not use the word socialism to describe what he did. But Bernie has done what many, many socialists have done, whether or not they use that adjective democratic socialist or not. Some do, some don't. They have used it mainly to mean that the government should have a national health program, and the government should provide free education, or at least close to that, and the government should create an absolute minimum, like a minimum basic income, that's another idea floating around, and so forth. It's a notion that what distinguishes socialism from capitalism is the role of the government in general and the role of the government as a support for the direct needs of the mass of people. That's the kind of thing. And that if it's required to do that by taxing wealth and high incomes and corporations, that's fine. That's what we should do, and we should do a lot of that, and that's what the society needs. And if you elect us, that's what we'll do. Okay? And that is one use of the term socialism. I think it's fair not only about the democratic socialists that are emerging here, the DSA organization and all of that, but in many of the European socialist parties, some of which are very large and many of which are powerful, that's their image pretty much also. They may disagree on these or that details. Scandinavian socialism is sort of like that, and German and Italian and French socialism are like that. The Labour Party was like that, but the Labour Party, I'm going to come back to them, in England is pushing further, which is really interesting because it's only their new leadership. They have a Bernie over there too, but they call him Jeremy. Jeremy Corbyn instead of Bernie Sanders. But they're about the same age, I think, and they are long-time political activists. But Corbyn has gone considerably further than Bernie has, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. The problem is socialism is not limited to that particular definition. Socialism has always been, and this is really important that everybody understands, has always been a contested issue. From the earliest days, socialists didn't agree with each other. They developed different ways of understanding socialism, different plans and programs if they were elected, or if they took over the government through a revolutionary procedure. They had disagreements. There's nothing new or different. It's not a sign that socialism is decaying, that it has disagreement. Probably runs the other way. That if there isn't disagreement, you got bigger problems. Something must be happening to shut it down. The first time it got really shut down was with the Russian Revolution, because the Russian Revolution produced a problem for socialists. Remember, the Russian Revolution was made at a time when all the different kinds of socialists all used the name socialist. They didn't use the name communist. Very, very rare. There was the label of that manifesto they wrote back in 1848, but there was no communists. There were no communist parties. The communist parties came out of Russia because when the Russians made a revolution, they imposed on the socialist world a tremendous question. Wow. We've been running around opposing capitalism, criticizing capitalism, building trade unions, contesting elections, but we never won anywhere. Now we got a new problem. We just won in this weird country, Russia, very poor, very big, and we won. That surprised, believe me, it surprised Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin as much as it surprised anybody else. Now we're in charge. And now we have to do something. Run the country, which is a very different business than being an opposition, as every opposition has learned if you get into that situation. Well, very quickly they began to do what seemed to them to be reasonable. And that's not what we're going to talk about now. But what I am going to make sure you understand is that when the Russians began to do something, they did it with unspeakably great prestige. They were the ones who won. It made every socialist everywhere else say, well, maybe I should do like them because they won. So what are we doing here in France or Spain or wherever, doing our things that are different from them because we have a different idea of socialism? But I mean, after all, they won. They must have figured out how to do it. That's why Lenin had the prestige that he did, in good part. Yes, he was a very sophisticated thinker, and he wrote an unbelievably body of work and all that. But the thing was, he won. They won. And you had an enormous split in the socialist world between those who said, we must be like them because they found the way. They are the ones who won. Those people dropped out of the word socialism and took the name communist. That's when all the communist parties were formed in 1918, 1920, 1921. Before that, there was no American Communist Party. There was no any communist party. Didn't have them. They were the socialists who wanted to follow Russia, who joined the Comintern and the organizations that were built around the Soviet Union. And the other socialists became critical of Russia, sometimes very profoundly. Many of you have been active. You know that the Trotskyite movement has a long, bitter history of animosity with the ones who were close to Moscow, because Stalin and Trotsky had a tremendous falling out, and they became great enemies, even though they were both socialists and all the rest of it. So I tell you this only that what I'm about to tell you, which is that socialism has reacted over the last 30 years to what happened in Russia, the collapse of the Soviet Union, to the changes in China, to the changes in Vietnam, in Cuba, and to the whole history. It wasn't just the West that responded to all of that with triumphalism. We won, we defeated them. I don't know how many of you read the famous article written by Robert Heilbronner, who was a professor at the New School. You know, he wrote an article that begins, in the great struggle between capitalism and socialism, that's now resolved. Capitalism won, socialism lost. And this was a socialist who wrote that. Well, the fact is, socialism, whatever you think of win and lose, socialism has changed. And one of the directions it has changed in, very, very important for me, so I want to tell you where I'm coming from here, is that it's a kind of socialism that is critical, not in a dismissive way, but in a hopefully a constructive way, critical of the focus of the old socialists on the state, on the notion that the state is what we need, the state to do this good thing, the state to do that good thing. Socialists have worried about that because if you give the state the power to do all those good things, you run a risk, which is with that amount of power, which you need to do the good things, you can also choose to do not so good things with that power. And that clearly has happened, and therefore has to be taken account of in some way. How do you deal with that? What's your response as a socialist to that situation? We know what the enemies of socialism do. They point to those kinds of behavior as a reason to reject socialism. Socialists aren't going to do that, but they are going to ask what else could it mean. And one of the major directions that is being taken now, and that I am part of, is to see socialism less at the macro level of society, at the big level, and more at the level of the enterprise. The workshop, the office, the store, the factory. That what socialism means, and this comes out of a reading of Marx, to which it is indebted, is a reorganization of the production process, so that the relationship employer-employee is done away with. It's a kind of a notion of capitalism as having been a historical case of misunderstanding. That capitalism grows out of a rejection of the dichotomy of slavery, master-slave. And it grows out of a rejection of the dichotomy of feudalism, lord, serf. It was to free people from all of that. Liberty, equality, fraternity, democracy, all these terms are get rid of that. And yet the economic system that establishes those slogans also establishes another dichotomy, employer, employee. And in this view, that's the fundamental problem. That's why you couldn't realize the slogans of the French and American Revolution. You never got liberty, equality, fraternity, or democracy. You got fakeries of it, formalities of it, but not the substance of it. Because you didn't break from the dichotomy master-slave, lord-serf, employer-employee. So what would it mean then to be a socialist? It would mean to end that dichotomy, or to use the language of Marx, to end exploitation, a situation where a mass of people produces a surplus that a small number of people gather into their hands, as most of us do in a corporation where the board of directors plays that role. You have to end that, which is a dramatic, daring bit. You have to end that and say that the democracy of the workplace is what socialism means. It means that everybody who works in any place, factory, store, office, one person, one vote, make the decisions. What to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits that everybody has helped to generate. Whether you call that a worker co-op or a commune, there's a lot of language issues, but that's a fundamental break that ends the dichotomies of slavery, feudalism, and that capitalism didn't end them. It just changed the form. It substituted employer-employee for what those had been. And for this kind of a socialism, that transformation at that point is what was missing in the Soviet Union and what was missing in China. There were efforts, there were some experiments, but we've had experiments in that in this country too. We still do. I talk sometimes about Mondragon in Spain because they try to do that. Or I talk about the Alvarado Street Bakery, for those of you who know, in Northern California, which is very successful at doing this and for decades. Or the Arizmendi bakeries, also in the Bay Area, and so forth and so on. That socialism, I think, is wending its way to an extraordinary change in what it means. And that change is going to be contesting with the older notions of socialism about the state and the importance of the state and the intervention of the state. And I think that in this country particularly, and we'll be different in other countries, but in this country, we have also a peculiarity. We have a long history of demonizing the state. So that people have had that association, powerful state, socialism. And so they're kind of prepared, they're trained to be hostile and skeptical and oppositional. But when you talk to them about socialism as the transformation of the workplace, they find the idea intriguing. They find the use of the word democracy to apply to the workplace as a way to make it palatable. Yes, I'm a Democrat, yes. When I go around and I say, look, you like democracy in the political, why the hell don't you want it in the economic? If you want to be able to vote for who leads you in politics, why don't you want to vote for whoever leads you in economics? Why is the boss not subject to your approval? He makes decisions, or she does, that affect your life, but you don't participate. You have no control at all. You claim to be in favor of democracy, but you don't have it in the workplace, which is where you spend most of your adult life. Hello? So how come you're not upset about being deprived of your democracy where you work? And why is it that the United States never installed democracy in its workplaces? Ever. A country that goes around the world dropping bombs on people to bring democracy to them doesn't have it itself to bring. Bizarre. And you know, we got rid of all the kings, and we said to ourselves as a human population, we don't need kings. Remember the kings, you know, monarchy? Not so long ago, there was a king, and he said, you are all my subjects. You need me. I talk to God 2 or 3 times a week, and I work things out, and that's why you're not dead. So you need me. You can't make decisions. You're stupid. You're poor. Look at you. I am riding around in a coach. I have 8 million servants. I have wonderful painters decorating my walls. You live in a hovel. Obviously, God wants me to be in charge, but He wouldn't want you to be in charge. And you couldn't have a society without the leadership of a king. And at a certain point, the human race separated these kingly types from their heads. Their heads rolled down a hill. I'm not suggesting anything. The heads rolled down the hill. The rest of them was left. Wasn't pretty. And after 5 years, nobody missed them. We have parliaments and we vote and we do all that. And yet we seem to believe that when we go to work, there has to be a king. The CEO has to have the power. A tiny group of people, a board of directors, 15 to 20 people in most corporations, no matter whether they have hundreds of thousands of employees, these 15 people are endowed with unspeakable power that's accountable to nobody who works under them. That's not democracy, folks. That's the opposite. That's monarchy at work. That's what we have. We have a monarchical work system, and socialism is its enemy. Socialism points it out. Socialism exposes it. Socialism makes it an issue, and socialism has the solution. This is scary. Socialism says, here's an alternative. Let us democratize the enterprise. It's a collective process, and we're going to run it as a democracy, and we're not going to be scared off by terrible predictions that there has to be a boss. Really? Really? There has to be a boss. That says more about you than about the boss, that you think that. Are you that little? Are you that afraid? Not just of your own power, but of the power of working people like you? I don't think the American people, let me push it politically, I don't think the American people are ready for this. I mean that in a good way. When we say it, they don't have the defenses organized. They have a lot of defenses against the government coming in and telling us what to do. They got lots of training in how to dispel that. But having a democratic workplace, we're catching them unaware, unprepared. This is a way to tell them what socialism is that makes it look really good. The truth of it is the socialism in the United States is the old kind, not yet this new kind. Even worse, if you look at the big polls, Gallup polls and others have shown that the young people, particularly in America, are now 50-50 on this socialism versus capitalism. Sometimes socialism wins, gets more than capitalists. But it's very clear when you talk to students, like I do all the time, young people, that this is not a measure of their desire and interest in socialism. It's a measure of their alienation from capitalism, which is disappointing them and frustrating them and angering them over and over again. And that's fine. That's the way it starts. But we're now entering, and that's why I'm doing this, we're entering a period where it's going to become more and more important that we understand and debate amongst ourselves these alternative notions of what socialism is, where it could go, what it might mean in terms of the political changes coming in this country. The more we are open to socialism, the more the differences within socialism will also return to the public conversation, just like the concept of socialism has. Shoot.
And so in your view of socialism, how would you deal with universal health care, which probably is better done by the government?
Yeah, I try when I do this speaking around the country, not to offer the notion of the focus on the enterprise and the organization as an alternative. Even in my speech to you just now, I went a little bit too far. It's the missing element that has to be added. It's not an opposition to government having all kinds of functions that it should have. Absolutely. If things are done better by the government, let's have the government do them. If things are done better by non-governmental, let's have that. That never was the... How do I put this? You won't find in Marx a big debate about public versus private. I think he would have thought that bizarre and beside the point. It's not whether it's public or private, it's how it's organized. In that public health, will that be a democratic workplace, that public clinic, or not? If the government takes over the steel factory so that the workers, instead of reporting to the board of directors, report to the commissars who have the same function, then you haven't transformed the workplace. You've transformed who the people are who sit at the top of it, but its pyramid shape is still there. So the question is, you want to transform, then you transform both the public and the private. But the choice between the two is a much secondary issue. Another way to understand that is the history of slavery and feudalism. There were public slaves and private slaves. Private people owned slaves, but so did states. Private people had serfs, but so did states. Capitalism is a private system, but also states have employees. That's never been the issue. That is an adjustment each society makes as it prefers a bit more of the state or a bit less of the state. But that's not at the core issue of what this system is like. That's a different matter. And for me, as I read Marx, as a person I study, this is the message. It's the transformation of the relations of production, how you relate to one another in the production process. And what it means, and how it will transform you. I mean, bear with me for a minute, and I will only take 5 more minutes, I promise. Imagine your life if you worked in a democratic workplace. You wouldn't then just have one job description. You'd always have 2. Whatever particular job you do in the division of labor, plus your participation in designing and running the business, because there's nobody who has only one function. No overling, underling. No design director and the directed. That's what we're getting rid of. And that's going to be an adjustment. We're going to have to change our schooling. We're going to have to change our whole conception of what it is to make a young person into an adult. You have to be able to take charge. You have to have that confidence in yourself, and you have to learn not to have confidence that there's somebody who's going to do it better to you. Just like you have to learn not to look for the next king just because you killed the first one. You know, maybe the issue wasn't to get rid of John in order to have Henry, but to get rid of the whole business. By the way, you know, we just changed our laws in this country to allow inheritance of all of this enormous wealth that has been concentrated. So we now are going to have, unless we do something, we're going to have dynasties. Not like on television, real ones. Mr. Bezos is going to be, the name Bezos will have a bigger kind of constant reference that the names Rockefeller and Carnegie used to have, because this is even more of a concentrated wealth. We're going to be a country of dynasties whose children are going to have the privileged positions in the media and in the arts and in politics because they are the child or the cousin or the nephew of the right family. I mean, all of these things will transform our society. A couple of things about the elections that I have to say before we go. Elections are always best understood if they are not looked at only for what the election was about. Always just as important is what the election was not about. What was not put up for a vote is at least as important as what was. This is an old Hegelian dialectic notion. Every presence is woven into an absence. The election made some things present and it made other things absent. There's the image, you know, the metaphor of the flashlight in the dark room. If you need to get across a dark room, you go for a flashlight. And you turn it on, and you point the flashlight into the darkness. And it does something wonderful. It illuminates a whole bunch of the obstacles that are in that room. But behind the obstacle, Everything is a shadow. Your very flashlight throws into the shadows what is behind the object illuminated. A flashlight therefore hides at the same moment that it illuminates. Everything is like that. Everything is this unity of the oppositions, and you make big mistakes if you don't see the opposite in everything. The good with the bad, the strong with the weak, and all of the rest of it. We are all crumpled up objects. There was no opportunity in this election to vote for capitalism versus socialism. It's a big issue in a lot of people's minds. Absent. Unavailable. You couldn't do it. Most people didn't even know if they had a candidate who had a position on socialism, what it was. Because those candidates kept it to themselves for whatever reasons. You had no chance. You could vote very demonstrably whether you were for or against immigration or guns that you can buy. There were issues that were put forward, and election should be about those. But much more interesting than what the election is what is kept from it, what is kept out of it. And another thing to understand about elections, and we'll maybe say something again when we meet in 2 months, 48% of the American eligible voted. In other words, once again, the majority of people in the United States didn't bother. This is very important. Even though we had a higher turnout for a midterm election than midterm elections usually have, that's true, but we still didn't manage to get a majority of the American people. The majority of the American people didn't go to the corner firehouse or the school or wherever the hell their voting place was. And it's very hard not to come away with the thought that there's not enough at stake for them to make it worthwhile. So they stayed home and watched TV, or forgot about it, or had a beer, or whatever else they did, because what was the point? And I don't think those are bad people, and I don't think those are, I think they're making a mistake. That's another matter. The interesting question is only why? What is this? And so here's the answer, my last point for today, I think. No, it's not that I think it's the last point. It's something that I think. Capitalism has always had a terrible trouble with elections and voting. In a system of universal suffrage, where everybody is, at least in general, eligible to vote, which we, the people, have fought long and hard for centuries to get that right. You all know that the initial United States, after our revolution, a tiny proportion of the people were eligible to vote. You had to be a man, you had to be white, you had to be property owner. I mean, when you did it, I don't know what the percentage was, but I'm sure it wasn't more than 10%, if that, of the people were eligible to vote. So it took a long time to get universal suffrage. But capitalism has a terrible problem. It has all the economic control in the hands of a small minority of people. The owners of businesses and the boards of directors that the owners elect, those are the people who run the businesses. That's a tiny minority of our population. They're always in danger that the majority, having the right to vote, will use the vote to undo what these people get out of the economy they control. In other words, their control, no matter how much they tell themselves, we are the owners of the business, we are the proprietor, the bottom line is the mass of people could reduce that to nothing in 2 seconds. Put a tax on it, you're done. Appropriate it, it's gone. Change the terms of employment, you don't make the decisions at all. They're constantly, so for them, the issue is always to prepare the population so that the election never does what it could do. So that it's an empty potentiality never realized. That's why the politics of the people who run this society is not about elections. It's about all the time other than elections, which they have to use so that by the time the election comes, it's not going to do anything. And they've succeeded at that. It doesn't do much. The first reaction in the Wall Street Journal after the results on the 6th of November was, oh, we're going to have gridlock. good, then the government will not bother us. They'll be fighting each other. That was the first reaction. Gridlock when the Republicans have the Senate and the Democrats have the House, so they won't get anything done because one side will negate what the other one does. Fine, said the business community. They were fine with Mr. Trump. Now they're fine with less Trump. And in 2 years they may be fine with no Trump at all. Because they've done all the work necessary, so by the time the election comes, between what the issues are and aren't, and what the candidates are and aren't, they've taken care of it. The left, by contrast, seems still fixated on the election, as if something magical was going to happen at the election that was different from what everything happens all day. If there's no left organizations talking to people, bringing up issues, explaining things, they have the media to do that. They have the universities to do that. They have the teaching and educational systems and the churches to do all that. We have to have the alternative institutions. Otherwise, by the time the election is coming, it doesn't matter for them at the top. And that may be the biggest clue to why 52% of the rest of Americans figured that out too. Thank you very much. I will see you in 2 months.